you either do an amputation if it is a multi-rooted tooth and you have fractured one of the roots, or a hemisection if it is a lower six, amputation if it is an upper six or any upper molar, and if it is a single rooted tooth, it should be extracted. So that the summary of the vertical tooth fractures, they are all caused by traumas. This is, let's say, the past of them. They will be seen directly or by the aid of transillumination and will show either no symptoms or reversible pulpitis and periodontitis pain with pockets, possibly. And they say this is the present signs and symptoms of them. And finally, the future of them is that they should be supplanted by a prosthetic crown with or without an endodontic treatment, or should be extracted accordingly. Okay, we have known the past, the present, and the future of the vertical tooth fractures. The second type of fractures, which are the transverse or oblique fractures that occur in the horizontal plane. This is the mostly like the Ellis classification fractures. The first one is the crown fractures that happens in the enamel only without chipping, enamel only with chipping, enamel and dentin, and enamel and dentin and pulp. The first case is when we have a horizontal fracture in the tooth that occurs in the crown only and that occurs in the enamel only and without chipping. As you can see here in this left central, when the enamel only is affected without chipping, which is also known as a craze line. So that this is the last case of the craze lines. The craze lines, as we have said and we are saying now, so that they are any fractures or cracks that occur in the enamel only without extending to the dentin or a little bit in the dentin, and in any plane, the sagittal plane, the coronal plane, or the transverse and oblique planes, any plane that is affected by the enamel only is called as a craze line. Okay. The second case, which is when the enamel only is affected with chipping of a part of the enamel, which is also known as Ellis class 1 fracture classification. Here, as we can see, that it is obviously the signs are a chipped part of the tooth enamel only, and the signs the symptoms are nothing or reversible pulpitis pain. Obviously, the treatment is a normal filling. The second type is the enamel and dentin fracture, which is also known as Ellis class 2 fracture. The signs, as we can see here, visible fracture. The symptoms are nothing or reversible pulpitis pain. The treatment is obviously a normal filling, but with a calcium hydroxide layer in the areas close to the pulp. The third case, which is when the enamel and dentin and pulp is affected, which is also known as Ellis class 3 fractures. The signs, we can see here that the pulp is exposed and the symptoms are reversible pulpitis pain, and the treatment here. Guys, you should always know that when there is any pulp involvement, I will talk about the pulp treatment plan for all the teeth in another video, but in general you should know that any pulp involvement will be treated by a pulpotomy procedure, whether it is partial or complete pulpotomy procedure, or a pulpectomy procedure, which is also known as endodontic treatment in the adult teeth, and then a crown that covers it, or an extraction procedure. That depends on the clinical case that we have. And so that this is the third case of the crown fractures of the horizontal fractures. The second type of cases that we have is when we have a horizontal fracture that is affecting the crown and root, which is also known as Ellis class 4. The Ellis class 4 fractures have the signs as follows: that the tooth fracture extends to the root, and the symptoms are reversible otitis pain and or pain on percussion, because here the periodontium are affected and there is a possibility of pulpitis, so that there will be a pain on percussion. Again, because the pulp is involved, so that we will need to do indirect, direct pulp capping procedures, or pulpotomy or pulpectomy procedures, or an extraction procedure. The last case that we have here is the transverse or oblique fractures that occur in the root only, that is also known as Ellis class 5 fractures. You should guys know that as much apically the fracture is, as the prognosis is better, because because you should know that and imagine that when we have a fracture in the tooth that is deep in the bone and surrounded by the blood, surrounded by immunity, it is like the fracture of a bone, for example the tibia or fibula, and that will subsequently be healed by bone tissues or connective tissues or bone and connective tissues, or possibly no healing will occur. But in general, when we have deep and apical horizontal root fractures, they might have a good prognosis, and the only thing that we should do is to splint the tooth and observe the tooth for the future time, and if it needed an endodontic treatment, we will do it for it. And if we have a fracture that is coronally located and it is close to the crown, what I do is to remove the fractured part, do an endodontic treatment, post and core, and a crown. This is what I do. There are so many ideas and things that we have in our class notes and lectures and in the textbooks, but I think for us as a general dental practitioners, we cannot do everything that specialists do. When I was studying the textbooks for the pedo, which is McDonald's, and for the endo, which is Cohen, every author says different thing and says the things that are best from his view and for his specialty. But us, as a general dental practitioners, we should have our own clinical judgment according to the clinical case that we have, and have a general information from those authors with great respect and gratitude for their offers and ideas that they give to us, so that as I told you, if it is fractured and close to the crown, we remove the fracture part, do endo, and post and core and crown. So that, as a summary, according to these planes that we have said, The fracture injuries are coronal or sagittal fractures, transverse or oblique fractures, and each one of them will affect the crown only, or the crown and root, or the root only. And the crown, when it is affected by a fracture, it will affect the enamel only, enamel and dentin, or enamel and dentin and the pulp is involved, which is called as a complicated trauma or fracture. This was the summary of the tooth fractures. I hope that it is understandable for you now, and that you now know that the enamel fractures of the crown fractures are always called as craze lines, no matter what is the plane that they are located in. And when we have the fractures that are vertical in dimension, and they are present in the crown, in the dentin and enamel, and or dentin and enamel and pulp, or they extend to the root, it is called as the cracked tooth syndrome. And when the fracture is in the vertical plane of the root only, it is called as a vertical root fracture. And when we have the fracture in the horizontal planes that is present in the enamel of the crown only, it is Ellis classification class 1, enamel and dentin class 2, enamel and dentin and pulp class 3, enamel and dentin and pulp and root class 4, and the root only is class 5. I hope now that the idea about the Ellis classification, the vertical root fractures, the cracked tooth syndrome, and the craze lines or infractions is clear for you now, and distinguishable, because I used to confuse them all before doing this presentation. Thank you for improving yourself by listening to this presentation. Always try to know, spread knowledge, and construct the world. Be kind to others, and that is because life is not short, but it is limited, and that is for the greatest benefit to the humankind.